Good morning, everyone. At least to those who are joining from the same time zone that I'm in. I'm in Ottawa currently, and my name is Obianuju. I'm the events officer with AKFC. So I'll be getting us started for today's session on advancing action on adaptation, and we'll be looking at the implications of COP28. Before I get us formally started, and pass it over to my colleague Liam. We're going to have a very quick Slido that I would like us to interact with. So there are three simple questions on Slido, and if you can use the QR code on the screen. So if you have a separate device, please go ahead and use a separate device, like a mobile device, if you can, to scan the QR code, or you can go to slido.com and you can go to slido.com and use the code 3693-445. So the first question that we have on here, I'll just backtrack a bit. Actually, just to start off is, what sector are you working in? So please let us know what sector you're working in for those who are joining today's session this morning. And I'll just wait as people are typing in. I see a few people already in Slido giving their responses. Some people from the NGO sector, healthcare, conservation and development, environment, education and research, academic, um, hospitality, climate change and women's leadership, finance, um, and I'll still give a few more seconds as other people add in their responses. Nutrition, horticulture, fair trade. So if you're joining our session, please use the link that we put in the chat, or you can scan the QR code if you have a mobile device on hand to do so, or you can just go to slido.com and then use the code, the number code that is shown on the screen to join the session, as we're taking a few questions to get a sense of where everybody is as they're joining our meeting today. So I'll move on to the next question. So we'd like to know what your experience is with climate adaptation initiatives. So for people joining today's session, would you say something that's new to you, or you're familiar with it, but no direct experience, or maybe you've done a little bit of research in this area, or you have also participated in projects? So we just like to, yeah, get a sense of people's level of engagement with the topic that we'll be going into further in today's session. So please take some time out to let us know what your experience is with the topic, and hopefully this session will help to fill in any gaps that may exist. Again, if you're just joining our meeting, please head over to slido.com and use the code shown on the screen to join. We're just taking a poll and getting people to answer a few questions. And then I'll transition over to the last question that I have for us today, which is asking us, what do we hope to get out of today's session? So depending on your level of engagement with the topic already, or for whatever reason you decided to join today's session, you saw it on social media, it was advertised in a network that you're part of, or a colleague sent it over to you. What is your intent for today's session? And hopefully our panelists and our speakers are also taking notes, and we'll do our best to ensure that we're meeting some of these expectations, or at least giving us the right framework to continue to delve further into this topic. So I'm seeing a lot of people placing emphasis on, just learnings for future, building their knowledge, building a better understanding of, the COP28 outcomes, following up about the decisions at COP, understanding adaptation goals, a reading on where we are. I see somebody else saying they're open to learn what others are doing and being inspired as well. So, yeah, they hope to share knowledge about the subject, learn about climate change and adaptation goals, action-based adaptation goals, some other more specific responses are coming in. So I'll give a few more seconds to allow others who are also just joining to get an opportunity to participate in the Slido poll. So if you're joining in, please use the code shown on your screen as you go to slido.com to join this very short quiz that we have going on. Okay, so I think we have a lot of responses coming in, and like I mentioned earlier, hopefully our speakers and our panelists are taking note of this as well. So to get us formally started with our session today, I would like to pass it over to my colleague, Liam, who's going to give us, a bit of an introduction of today's session, set the scene, and kick us off into the rest of today's conversation. So over to you, Liam.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Liam Thorne, and I'm a Program and Partnerships Officer with Agcon Foundation Canada. It's my pleasure to welcome both Canadian and international participants and speakers, and to extend my deep respect to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, whose unceded ancestral lands I join you from today, and I extend this respect to the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, where the Agcon Foundation Canada offices are located. We are grateful for the stewardship and courage of elders and traditional knowledge keepers, past, present, and future. We make this acknowledgement to reaffirm our commitment to strengthening relationships, improving our own understanding of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and cultures across Canada and Turtle Island, critically examining our privilege and moving forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. We recognize that since time immemorial, the Algonquin peoples have been coming together at this place where three rivers meet in a spirit of exchange of goods and services, but also of relations and ideas. And so we seek to continue that centuries-old tradition of sharing and exchanging ideas and building relationships. This session is part of Agcon Foundation Canada's speaker series on climate resilience and adaptation, which is supported by Global Affairs Canada. Today, in cooperation with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, we'll be exploring adaptation-related outcomes of COP28, considering implications for practitioners and local communities. We're very pleased to welcome colleagues from the Agcon Agency for Habitat, Plan International Canada, and RARE, who will be sharing their perspectives and expertise in both the panel discussion and breakout groups. To set the stage for this discussion, we'll start the session with a presentation on adaptation outcomes from COP28 from IISD's Emily Beauchamp. Emily is lead on monitoring, evaluation, and learning, MEL, with the International Institute for Sustainable Development's Resilience Program. She has over 15 years of experience in MEL and research methods in environmental change and sustainable policy. Emily's work focuses on policy and practices related to the design of MEL and evidence systems across the adaptation policy and planning cycles, including analysis, guidance, and technical support for the National Adaptation Plan, NAP, processes. She has been researching, supporting, and advising on adaptation in the UNFCCC process since 2017, with a focus on the global goal on adaptation and works of the Adaptation Committee. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you very much, Liam. I'm just going to share my screen. I hadn't realized my short bio was so long, so apologies for this.
Emily, we'll have your PowerPoint up shortly.
Wonderful. That's great. Well, thank you so much for the Agcon Foundation of Canada for having me today, and thank you everyone for being here and having this great discussion. I think this is really great to see. I see we have 66 participants online, and it's really heartwarming to see all the interest about understanding what are some of the adaptation outcomes from COP28, but most interestingly, what's next for practitioners. Next slide. So today I'm going to provide just a quick overview of what were some of the COP28 adaptation items or the discussions that were held on adaptation to COP28. What are some of the gaps and some of the wins? And we're going to zoom into what is the most impactful decision of COP28 for adaptation, which is the global goal on adaptation. And we're going to turn to what this means to practitioners. Please feel free to, as Anya mentioned, please feel free to post your questions in the chat. And then we'll look at it after in the panel. Next slide. So, and I'm going to put ahead that I've not kept the 101 rule of keeping text on slide being very short, just because the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, has a lot of acronyms and has a lot of very specific lingo. So I wanted to put it on the slide so that people can visually also read. Sometimes that helps also, or the times of listeners and participants. And that's also going to be slides that I think are going to be shared. So you will have that information after, if it's a bit of information overload for those who are not used to the UNFCCC. Please also call me out on any acronyms. I'm going to do my best. So some of the key adaptation items at COP28 were the Global Stocktake and the adaptation section. So the Global Stocktake is a mechanism as part of the Paris Agreement that assesses the global or the collective progress of all of the items of the Paris Agreement every 5 years. And the aim is to talk stake of what happened, what hasn't happened, and raise ambitions for the next 5 years. So the Global Stocktake is a stocktake exercise being done every 5 years. And of course, it covers the main pillars of the Paris Agreement, which are mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation, and that is capacity building, finance, and technology transfer. It also covers loss and damage. I'm going to go to that later. Another big discussion, and that was really the big ticket for COP28, that was the discussion on the global goal on adaptation, which is, I'm going to go into that a bit later, but the discussions were about defining and agreeing on a framework to assess the collective progress on adaptation. It came a bit belatedly, but we'll explain why a bit later. And there were other items that I feel are noteworthy to mention for folks that are working on different levels. So for example, work of the Adaptation Committee. So the Adaptation Committee is the constituted body in the UNFCCC that is working on technical work on adaptation. So it's producing a lot of expertise and guidance on adaptation. And there was also discussion about national adaptation plans. Finally, there were matters related to the Adaptation Fund. So that's linked to meeting the 2021 COP26 goal of doubling adaptation finance. And there were discussions about loss and damage. Now, I'm going to caveat that I'm not going to talk too much about loss and damage. It is now becoming a pillar on its own, but it's long been considered as part of adaptation. But because of the developments in recent years, then we're not going to cover that as much today because there's so much content as well. Next slide. So gaps and wins overall, and I'm going to go in retrospective order. Overall, it's good to say that there were, unfortunately, mostly disappointing outcomes on the level of adaptation. It's COP28. The reality is that adaptation is often forgotten or is often traded off with regards to other climate change strategies such as loss and damage and mitigation. So countries will favor making bigger decisions on mitigation or on loss and damage rather than adaptation. So this we've really seen true as two of the negotiation discussions closed on having first very difficult negotiations, but also closed on inconclusive statements. So basically there was no agreement on the Adaptation Committee and the review of its report. And also there was only a procedural decision on matters related to adaptation plans, which means that you just start from scratch at the next meeting. So zero progress on 2 of the 4 adaptation items. With regards to the Adaptation Fund, one thing that we've seen this year is that the Adaptation Fund raised only half of its expected funding targets. And that's really the first year where it's performing as badly. And there's strong expectation that this is because of the establishment of the new loss and damage fund, which, you know, the operationalization of the fund for loss and damage is a historic moment, but it's bringing noticeable trade-off with adaptation in terms of like bringing the attention, even the number of negotiators and experts who are working on loss and damage versus adaptation. So there's a lack of consideration that more adaptation is needed to avoid irreversible losses and damages. And the two issues are basically almost pegged one against the other. That's very dangerous. And we started seeing signs of this. Next slide. One more. Oh, I thought that was a bit. So one of the very, very big theme for the COP28 was the global stocktake. So what have we found over the past 5 years that was being done that's not been achieved? And the global stocktake process, for those who are not familiar with it, is actually a 2-year process. So this started in 2021 when there were consultation, and there have been multiple consultations per year to get the inputs, you know, roundtable dialogue, special consultations directly with parties and with negotiations groups on what are some of the collective progress on mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. And in terms of adaptation, so some of the positive are that it recognizes that there has been progress, but there are still significant gaps and challenges remaining, especially in terms of finance and capacities. And this is important to think about, you know, if we put ourselves back in the shoes of, you know, 2023 and 2022, when there has been increasing dramatic flooding, for example, in Pakistan and in other places in the world. There has been wildfires in multiple places in Canada and in Europe and in Australia. There's been a lot of climate impacts. So we were expecting, the world was hoping for much more than just saying there's significant gaps and challenges. Another good point is that it recognized the role of nature for adaptation, and that the alignment between climate and biodiversity is essential to achieve synergies with the Convention of Biological Diversity. There are some mentions of gender equality and social inclusion, but they are quite weak mentions. So, you know, the text refers to, you know, parties should do this where possible. So we don't have a very good emphasis on what is a good quality adaptation. That gender equality and social inclusion is critical to deliver fair and inclusive adaptation results. And finally, there's 3 main things that were missed from the Global Stocktake. So the need to mainstream climate risks across planning and development and practice, as we're going to talk today. The failure to emphasize the importance of locally led adaptation, and the failure to emphasize the need for a concrete roadmap for sufficient finance. So of course, making adaptation happen is not just about money, but money is also a very important part. And too often there is finance going to mitigation, but there's not as much going to adaptation. Next slide. Now, and I see there are some questions. Keep on going the questions, I'll respond to these after. So one of the main wins was the framework on the global goal and adaptation. And there's a couple of caveats, but to explain, the Paris Agreement established the global goal and adaptation in 2015. And this was a response for mostly developing countries to scale up action on adaptation and to bring adaptation on parity with mitigation and to increase the visibility of adaptation action. And the GGA really aims to be the equivalent to the 1.5. But as we may know, there is not a one single metric to adaptation. So it was a bit more complicated than for mitigation to develop the global goal on adaptation. And these discussions took, as we can see, from 2015, it took 8 years to have a full framework with, as you can see on the right, with a vision, different dimensions of change and sources of information, and a defined process basically to assess global progress on adaptation. Next slide. So there are some great wins from what we have here. And you see here, I call it the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience. This is the new official name of the GGA. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but we're going to try to call it the UAE FGCR, so the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience. And what it has done, more than anything, I need to emphasize it, that is really cemented how adaptation is being, sorry, I see someone cannot read the slides very well. I'm not sure if something can be done. It's really cemented how adaptation should be said and should be conceptually framed, not just by countries, but also by private sector, by practitioners, by communities. And it offers a non-prescriptive, but a high-level framework where we can actually then collect evidence on the. Most importantly, it has sets of targets according to the 4 dimensions of the adaptation cycle. So it includes targets on how countries should assess impact, vulnerability, and risks, how much countries should plan for adaptation in terms of developing adaptation plans that are transparent and inclusive, that countries should implement adaptation measures, and also that countries need to monitor, evaluate, and learn from adaptation, because otherwise we can't have adaptive management. Next slide. There's also 7 targets that I mentioned on the other slide, but they are here now on the right-hand side of the slide. So we have targets related to 7 key factors that are globally recognized to be important for adaptation. So water and sanitation, food and agriculture, city, settlement, infrastructure, health, poverty, livelihood, ecosystem and biodiversity, and cultural heritage. So this is a great framework for folks who are thinking, okay, how should I think about adaptation? What is the process? The process is assess the risks, plan your adaptation based on these vulnerabilities and risks, implement the adaptation plan, and make sure that you do monitoring, evaluation, and learning to know if you're doing the right thing and it doesn't lead to maladaptation. And also pay specific attention to these 7 themes, because these are some of the global important themes that we can see need most attention. But obviously, adaptation is very grounded in context. Some things that it doesn't do, again, it mentions the role of cross considerations, nature-based solutions, country-driven process, but it doesn't mandate them. So it's a very weak saying, you should do gender responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approaches, but you don't have to. And most importantly, it has failed to integrate the need to track, finance, capacity building, and technology as critical factors for accelerating adaptation. Next slide. In terms of next steps, and I'm going to go through this quick. So there is a new program that's been launched. So there is further work that will be done on the GGA. There is a UAE Belen work program that is going to terminate at COP30. So that is in 2025. And so there are submissions that are invited by parties and by observers to express their opinions on how the work program should be organized. In terms of practitioners, this is very process oriented. So you may want to wait until the UAE program is organized before you really direct your intention onto how to input at that level. Next slide. So what it comes next, and really this is setting the scene to what our next wonderful panel is going to talk about. So there are several outcomes of adaptation at COP28 that were disappointing, but the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience, or the GGA framework, does represent a really important milestone and sets a critical basis for future work on adaptation. Now, global frameworks help signal directions for work, but implementation on this adaptation works. It happens through countries, it happens through practitioners, and it happens with local communities. So it's critical for practitioners not to wait and to work to advance the UAE FGCR and adaptation with special attention on creating the need and information and evidence to track, assess, and inform adaptation decisions, delivering inclusive and just locally led adaptation, and bringing out local voices, aligning and mainstreaming climate with nature and development work, not having silos, and finally, helping to bridge the gap and track the gap for adaptation finance. So this was a very quick overview. I look forward to reading your questions on the side. And this is all for me for now.
Thank you very much, Emily, for this really useful and helpful presentation in terms of setting the international context for adaptation initiatives. And I'm really looking forward to the panel being able to dive deeper into this discussion in terms of how this relates to local initiatives. Before we do so, I'd like to introduce Dheeraj Gurung, Chief Scientist for the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, who will offer us insights into adaptation initiatives that are ongoing in high mountain areas of Asia. This is a region in which local communities are experiencing heightened climate impacts, and it's a valuable case study into why locally led adaptation is so critical in terms of addressing the specific needs of communities, but also how different information sources can contribute to locally contextualized development. So Dheeraj is a graduate of Jadavpur University in India with a degree in geological sciences and holds a master's degree in geomorphology from the Tokyo Metropolitan University in Japan. He has over 24 years of experience altogether working in the field of as a geologist with the government of Bhutan, and moved on to the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, where as a remote sensing specialist, he worked in areas of climate change and disaster risk reduction, DRR domains. He joined the Aga Khan Development Network as a program coordinator for preparedness and safety with the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, AKHA, in January of 2018. He moved to AKHA Geneva's office as the chief scientist and is actively engaged with the science fraternity and practitioners to bridge the gap between science and programming. Welcome, Dheeraj.
Thank you, Liam. Am I audible? Okay, yeah, thank you. I'll wait for yes. So what I'll do quickly is I'll try to put my case why we should focus on mountains, mountains, and bring mountains in the forefront of global discourses with 2 slides, and then follow up those 2 slides with 3-4 slides presenting on some of the case studies that AKHA as an agency has been implementing in terms of building adaptations of the communities in the high mountain geographies that we work across. Next. So high mountain Asia, as I said, or high mountain in general, has been in the back burner in many years in terms of global discourses. But I think it's time that we bring on the forefront the mountains in the discussion of the global level, and particularly in view of the climate changes and the impacts on the populations, vulnerable populations on the ground. Here, if you could see on the map, there is a map that stretches from Central Asia to the Eastern Himalaya. This is called High Mountain Asia. And I have indicated Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan there for the fact that I will be showcasing some of the adaptation work AKHA has been leading in this region. These high mountain regions, apart from being very multi-hazard environment, you see lots of hazards happening there. Emily also talked about some of the cases just a while ago. This high mountain system are also inherently challenging because of the physical challenges, climatic challenges, accessibility challenges, and so on. And thus the people living there are highly vulnerable. So when you have a multi-hazard environment juxtaposed with a vulnerability hotspot, it certainly leads to a very high risk scenario on the ground. So you are talking about a very high risk region. If you add climate to it, next slide. If you add climate to it, it will further aggravate the situation because of the reason that the hazard will also, the frequency and intensity will also increase, as well as the resources under the new climate scenario could be even further scarce. So it will further heighten the risks. There are already studies because of what we have been referring as elevation dependent warming, meaning that higher elevations are warming faster than the lower elevations. The high mountain Asia is warming about 11-10% faster or higher than the other regions of the world. Next slide. And this is what I'm presenting here is a source from our data that AKHA has been collecting over several years from the region that we have been working, you can clearly see that 81% of the hazard records that we have collected is climate induced. You have avalanche, snow avalanche dominating the maximum of the event that happened, including then followed up by flood. So 81% of the events that had happened in the past are climate induced hazards. Then next slide. Then if you see the trend, there is an increasing trend that you can clearly see from 2017 to 2026. So every year that we see the events becoming more frequent, also more intense. And this is why I think we really need to focus on adaptation in the mountainous setting, particularly from the point of addressing the impacts of climate changes that's being brought about by the different scenarios on the hazard as well as the vulnerability. Now let me go into next slide. Let me go into some of the very localized and also working with the examples of working with the communities in order to help communities develop the capacity to adapt to the climate change. The first thing that I wanted to speak about is I think risk awareness is key to the informed climate adaptation. We really need to know what are the threats, what are the risks, and also as you go at the very finer granularity and working with the community, you also need to know not just what but where. So engaging with the community at the very local level, our team has been doing hazard mapping, vulnerability mapping, and try to see what is happening, where it's happening, and how intense and how things are on the ground, how things are changing on the ground. So if you could see on the map, our team goes to the field, talks with the communities, discusses with the community, engages with the communities, and maps all the hazards, all the exposures, and also if you could see on the yellow circle, these are the area where we have identified as a safe place for communities to move if there is any unfortunate event that happened. Next. This is what we call internally as HVRA. HVRA stands for Hazard Vulnerability and Risk Assessment, and this really gives us that the risk scenarios at the very finer granularity. On the right is what we produce, HVRA map, and you can clearly there also see which are the red areas, which are the orange areas, which are the green areas. Red areas are the area that we need to avoid. Green areas are the safe areas where we need to focus on our investment on the development. So far, we have done this kind of community-based risk assessment for 2,848 settlements across Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. And next step that we follow up with the HVRA map is that we use this information, that intelligence gathered through the community engagement, to develop a village level disaster management plan where we identify where are the hazards, where are the opportunities, where are the capacities, where are the vulnerable people, where are the safe sites, and so on. So this hazard map or exercise to map the risk leads into developing a very detailed village disaster management plan, even in some cases in the local language, and which has been used to appraise the government people, community leaders, and also regional government leaders, and also to inform our DRR programs and habitat development programs within ACA and across AKDN network. Next. The other thing that we have been implementing across these three countries is an early warning system. We have so far in Afghanistan, Pakistan, about 31 early warning systems, 21 in Afghanistan and 10 in Pakistan. These are mostly for the floods, but there are also for landslide and rock falls. The picture that you are seeing is something that we have used as a part of monitoring surging glacier. This surging glacier is a phenomenon that's mostly in the Hindu Kush Himalaya, Karakoram and the Pamir region, where you see that glaciers are not just retreating but also surging and creating some hazards on the downstream. So we have used CCTV camera and community support to monitor that. On the right, we also have some cases where we have used IT and IoTs to create, develop an early warning system for floods in Afghanistan and so on. Next. Early sensing or sensing is one part of the equation. What we also really need to do is information be mobilized, maybe used to mobilize the communities on the ground. So we have worked with the communities and trained them to be able to create a pool of ready and equipped communities to respond to any early warnings, early signs of any impending dangers. What we have been able to do is about train almost 26,314 community emergency management teams across these 3 countries, of which 40% of or so are female volunteers. Next. Finally, we have also been helping the communities deal with problem related to the water scarcity. We have been actually in Pakistan since late 90s that we have implemented some of the award-winning programs on sanitation, water and sanitation across Pakistan. We have been able to construct about 32,000 plus latrines, providing 400 villages and benefiting about 200 plus people across the region with clean water for consumption. Similarly, in Tajikistan as well, we had done lots of work on provisioning of safe drinking water to about 10 districts, covering about 600,000 households. And also we are still doing lots of work in Afghanistan, trying to provide better access to the communities on water, drinking water as supplies and so on. So this is what we have been doing across our region of ACAS operation across these 3 countries. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this, Dioraj. This case study really highlighting the varied conditions and unique initiatives that communities are undertaking to adapt to climate change. With this, I'd like to turn to our panel discussion on COP28 outcomes for adaptation, which Emily will be moderating. Emily will be joined by Dioraj Gurung from ACA, as well as Kristen Ostling from Plan International Canada and Emily Goodwin from RARE. Kristen Ostling is Plan International Canada's Senior Advisor for Policy and Advocacy. As a policy and advocacy leader with over 15 years of experience, Kristen is passionate about gender equality and human rights, including the rights of girls in Canada and around the world. Based on solid research, dialogue, and collaboration, a central part of her work has been developing and executing integrated policy advocacy strategies. Kristen has worked on a wide range of climate policy issues, including loss and damage, locally led adaptation, and climate finance. At COP28, Kristen led influencing, monitoring, and reporting on negotiations for Plan International. Emily Goodwin leads RARE's international climate policy engagements, working to advance biodiversity, climate action, and investment, and utilizes RARE's expertise in behavior change to support an accelerated climate positive cultural shift. Prior to joining RARE, she coordinated the adaptation and climate resilience portfolio at IUCN, leading both project management and international policy engagement on ecosystem-based adaptation projects from mangrove restoration to green-gray infrastructure. She has had a long history of coordinating partnerships in this space, including as chair of the Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation Networks for 5 years, and as a co-founding member of the Global Mangrove Alliance. Emily, panelists, I turn this discussion over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Liam, and thank you, Dioraj, for your presentation. I'm delighted to have all of us on a panel. And it's great to have a bit of a taste from Dioraj on some of the practical applications of how we can build on the signals of what good adaptation should be and implement it, because really, COP28 has provided decisions and momentum on the global goal on adaptation and set direction for adaptation action and for the evidence needed to support those actions. There was a comment in the chat about the need for the global stocktake to be more frequent than every 5 years, and I completely agree. Unfortunately, with the way of UNFCCC bureaucracy, this is not going to happen for a while. But this is why practitioners in countries and other actors really need not wait and work now to make the global decisions and the global signals become meaningful when they're implemented at the local level by a range of actors. So we'll be asking our panelists, what are some of the different aspects of the latest COP decisions on adaptation? What does that mean to them? And also what practitioners can do to accelerate adaptation actions in line with the recent discussion at UNFCCC, and with a special eye on evidence. So the breakout group will also follow and will explore entry points to advance adaptation work along these lines. So first, let me follow up with on the back of Dheeraj's presentation. And Dheeraj, so the GGA decision presented a milestone for adaptation and really highlighted the need and the momentum to have better monitoring, evaluation, and learning and information systems to track, assess, and learn about progress on adaptation. So in line with your work, how are communities effectively bringing scientific data and local knowledge to inform their community adaptation initiatives and decisions? And what are some of the considerations that are important when integrating information system and science in locally led initiatives?
Thank you very much for this question. I think lately we have seen. Can you hear me? Lately we have seen there is a greater recognition of the importance of local knowledge and the role of communities. We have seen a paradigm shift from working for the communities to working with the communities. We have really been able to working with the communities in recent years, and leading to many engagement approaches like participatory appraisal processes. And also there is now a greater engagement of communities through something called citizen science initiatives. Now, there is larger integration of communities in data gathering, data feeding process. However, I think we still hear and use the words like, when you refer to the communities and users. And also, I think sometimes we also use words like last mile. I think we need to get away from that and bring communities in the forefront and the center of our engagement. And in our context, I think SBRA really stands out as a good example of how we could work with the communities to understand the risk and what are the needs on the ground. And I just wanted to share also an example of how we have used community in terms of bridging the science the gap between the science and the local knowledge. We understand that the terrain that we have worked are so challenging that we will not be able to have gaze stations everywhere. So what we have done is we have mobilized 88 volunteers to man and manually what we call a weather monitoring post, where they report everyday temperature, precipitation, rain, snow, any event that happens around that. We have been collecting these climate data through manually operated weather monitoring posts, and we have been able to share this with the researchers all around the world for supporting their science work. The second question that you asked was consideration and importance integrating information science and system. I think I have been fortunate to be on the both sides of the fences. I've worked on the research as well as the community program. So what I've seen speaking from the science perspective is that sometimes scientists and researchers, when they talk about working with the communities, they get so excited and they jump lines, they jump queues, and directly go and start interacting with the communities, forgetting that there is an in-between enablers like CBOs, community-based organizations, who understand the language of both the sides. I think we have to realize that the language is spoken by the science and the communities are completely different. You need somebody in between as an enabler to help us communicate science to the communities. That is definitely a big thing that we need to consider. So I think on the community side, I think what I realized so far working is that we do not have that capacity to understand, absorb, extract, access the data, and use it. In both the case, what I see, first thing that we need to do is work with the local champions. Identify a local champion, work with the local champions. Second consideration is simplify the way that you serve the data, package the data. And the way to do is co-generate or co-develop the system or the data if possible. Third consideration would be try to bring community. If you speak about the science and the researchers, community has always been afterthought. When they design the program, when they design the research program, communities are not really consulted. I think it's important that we bring community in the forefront and engage them in while you even design and develop the research and applications. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dheeraj, for these very important and yeah, insightful considerations. I think, yeah, always bring the communities at the forefront. And I think, I mean, it flows through very well. I'm now going to turn to Kristen to look at kind of another side of bringing community in. So we've seen in both the Global Goal Adaptation and the Global Stocktake decisions that the inclusion of some cross-cutting considerations should guide the continuous and progressive adaptation actions. So that includes, in the text, they mentioned gender responsive, participatory, fully transparent actions to adaptation to ensure intergenerational equity and social justice. So first, where do we see the greatest progress on gender equality and intergenerational equity related to adaptation at COP28? So what stood out for you?
Thanks so much. It's really great to be with you here today to talk about this really important issue of action on adaptation. And for me, in the lead up to and at COP28, what really stands out are the powerful voices and meaningful engagement of youth, especially girls and young women who are advocating for meaningful, tangible climate action. One of the young women that I met, 14-year-old Faith from Malawi, is already experiencing the impact of climate change, and really her key adaptation ask was around education, and she, youth around the world have been calling for increased climate education. What Faith says is that she would like to see as part of an adaptation measure education as a global climate education as a global priority, and that it should be a part of curriculums all around the world. She also said that she is part of the generation that is feeling the biggest consequences of the climate crisis and wants to be part of the generation that ends this crisis. I think it's really important for us in terms of locally led adaptation to take into account the voices, the knowledge, the experience of youth. We couldn't have gotten the achievements at COP28 without that advocacy of youth. I want to give you a couple of examples of the specific text, although, as you know, Emily, as you pointed out, it's not perfect, but this is where we've seen some progress. So, for example, in the negotiated text, and I'm going to call it the framework instead of the Global Goal on Adaptation, just for short. So the guidance in the negotiated text is to, and I'm going to quote this, to take into account country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent approaches, as well as human rights approaches to ensure intergenerational equity and social justice, taking into consideration vulnerable ecosystems, groups, and communities, including children, youth, and persons with disabilities. So really an important piece of progress. Then with regards to planning, the framework states that by 2030, all parties should have in place country-driven, and again, gender-responsive, participatory, and fully transparent national adaptation plans, policy instruments, and planning process and strategies. On education, what was really seen as a critically important piece of progress is acknowledging the importance of education as part of effective adaptation efforts. The framework encourages efforts by all parties to broaden climate education, to empower people, in particular children and youth, with the knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes necessary for active action to combat climate change. And then I noticed that, of course, some of the people around this table today are focused on health. And another issue where we saw progress is that the framework acknowledges the importance of attaining resilience against climate change related to health impacts, promoting climate resilient health services, and significantly reducing climate related morbidity and mortality, particularly in the most vulnerable communities. So an important achievement there. In terms of the gaps, I just want to emphasize, Emily, what you said is that there are two really big gaps, and one is on financing and the other, I think, is on reporting. There's a lack of specificity in terms of targets and timelines. We know that financing for adaptation from a gender equality and children's rights perspective is woefully inadequate. A big loophole in the global in the framework when it comes to reporting. The agreement affirms that no additional reporting burden is placed on parties through the implementation of the framework. We shouldn't see reporting as a burden. Rather, we should see it as an essential element of tracking progress as well as our success and documenting that. So, I think that has to be changed. In terms of the next steps, I really wanted to also emphasize that COP28, like all COPs, is a moment in time, and it's just what's most critical leading up to COP29 is advocacy. We need to scale up advocacy at the local and national levels. We need to continue to work in coalition across sectors to encourage governments to take the right decisions at COP29. And I want to emphasize too to everyone that we're going to have a big focus at COP29 on the next global goal, which is the new collective quantified goal on financing. And this decision on climate finance is vital. Finance is an absolutely essential part of the enabling environment for achieving all of our goals. And apart from an agreement about scaled up funding, which we desperately need to see, this new goal must address timeframes, measures, and tools for tracking, accounting, and an agreement about where the funding goes and how it should be spent and directed. And this includes from a gender equality, children's rights, and intergenerational equity perspective. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Kristen. And that's great. And also, I can speak from having been at multiple COPs and hearing and seeing youth negotiators and advocates, and they were so inspiring. And I think it's very important to look at them as the leaders, not just for the future, but for now as well. I'm now going to turn to Emily. So we've discussed the potential for adaptation work. It's great to discuss the potential work for adaptation. So adaptation work contributes to the GGA, to the ultimate goal of global warming adaptation, and to creating new evidence. But global discussions and reports in 2023, for example, we can think about the United Nations Environmental Programme Adaptation Gap Report, and I've actually put that in the chat a bit earlier on in response to comments, and the annual report 6 from the IPCC, assessments report, apologies, they keep on pointing to an increasing gap in adaptation finance. So the GGA echoes the importance of using nature-based solutions and of supporting finance and other means of implementation to deliver adaptation. But can you tell us a bit more in the context of nature-based adaptation initiatives? What kind of innovative financing schemes are being developed that can address local finance needs to start bridge this finance gap, please?
Thanks, Emily. So to build on Kristen's remarks and quickly set the finance context, as you've mentioned, the last adaptation gap report demonstrated that adaptation finance needs are some 10 to 18 times higher than current finance flows. Back in 2021 at COP26 in Glasgow, parties called to double adaptation finance and reach 40 billion by 2025, which we're definitely not on target to meet. And despite the fact that adaptation costs are rising and expected to, of course, continue to rise, adaptation finance flows have actually declined since 2020, while mitigation finance continues to increase. And then to laser focus in on the nature context, the percentage of this spent on sort of ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions for adaptation is something like less than 1% of total adaptation finance. I also want to note that even as we talk about this at this macro level of sort of international adaptation finance and these huge numbers, this funding too often actually struggles to reach the ground. I think it's an estimated 66% of allocated adaptation funds are successfully dispersed, compared to 98% of general development finance. And only about 17% of public adaptation finance is allocated to projects that are focused on local communities, despite being at the front lines of climate change. So I don't want to belabor the negatives here. It sounds like I'm giving a bit of an obituary of adaptation finance. But the fact of the matter is that, yes, the financing infrastructure needs to evolve. And yes, countries desperately need to commit more to adaptation finance. But an increase in public financing alone is unlikely to really ever close that gap. So I want to zoom in a bit to what this looks like on the ground and what do we as practitioners do about it. My organization, RARE, is known for driving behavior change for climate and conservation outcomes, particularly in support of frontline communities of small-scale coastal fishers and smallholder farmers. And driving new sources of finance into these communities is a critical component of our adaptation work. I want to share quickly 2 examples of this today. The first of these is a new product, the Small-Scale Fisheries Impact Bond, which we launched at COP28. The impact bond is pooling different finance sources to channel funding towards community-led management of coastal fisheries in Indonesia. This is a type of blended finance structure which sort of nudges the private sector to invest in adaptation and resilience by utilizing public and philanthropic funds to de-risk the private investment in these solutions. The impact bond is structured as what is called an outcomes-based finance mechanism, which means that once our predefined project criteria are achieved and independently verified, our private investors are actually repaid their initial investment by our outcome funders, which is the public and philanthropic finance. So the public finance is really only paid out once the outcomes are achieved. The model is not new. Outcome-based finance models have been successful in sort of other sectors like health and education, but this is the first time we're really specifically applying it to unlock funding for coastal resilience of fishing communities. And this is one of the models that we hope to really be scaling up over the next few years. Secondly, I think there was already a question in the chat about sort of the engagement of the insurance sector in some of these solutions. So my second example is that we also work to design and deploy different insurance types to help cover local communities from the financial fallout of climate change. In the Philippines, we've deployed an innovative parametric insurance scheme that aims to combat coastal fisherfolk's income losses during climate-induced adverse weather. Parametric insurance schemes are structured to pay out automatically when predefined criteria occur. In our case, the policy is triggered and the payouts made to local communities when certain wave height, wind speed, and rainfall criteria prevent them from safely fishing. In order to sort of sign up for the scheme, fishers must be formally registered with the government and also commit to sustainable fishing practices, which is supporting sort of the long-term ecological resilience in addition to the short-term financial resilience. And this is currently being piloted in certain areas. The goal over the next few years is to scale this up nationally in the Philippines as a set benefit of vessel registration. So I just want to wrap that up by saying that, yes, there is this global adaptation finance gap that is sort of being debated and addressed under the UNFCCC, but also these sort of innovative local and national solutions can really support channeling new sources of finance to communities to support climate resilience initiatives.
That's amazing. That's great. And it gives us hope to hear from the three of you in terms of what can be done and what should be done in the field, or, you know, with communities and to advance adaptation action just now. We have 5 minutes before I open for Q&A, and I would just like to basically have a quick round, right, panelists, to ask, how do you think practitioners can work with governments to achieve the targets that are included in the GGA? So it's great for practitioners to work, you know, do their own work. Sometimes it's in bilateral. So how do you bridge some of these work with countries who are then participating in the UNFCCC? And I think that's a great lead for our follow-up breakout groups after. So quickly, would someone like to go first, please? I'm going to go opposite direction. Emily, what's one of
I was
key?
about to jump in, so it works well.
Go ahead.
So specifically on sort of the nature adaptation interface, I do just want to sort of echo what you said in your presentation, that the COP28 decisions, both the Global Goal on Adaptation and the GST, really did recognize and reaffirm the role that nature plays for adaptation. We also saw this joint statement on climate, nature, and people by the UNFCCC and CBD COP presidencies, which called to better align the commitments, the NDCs, NAPs, and national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And after being in this space for a number of years, I think we are really at a point where this sort of nature adaptation interface is no longer a fringe discussion, but now quite mainstream and cross-sectoral. So I think we're in this moment of shifting our focus from recognition of nature-based solutions for adaptation to really facilitating effective implementation of nature-based solutions. So to answer your question, sort of what needs to happen, I think this political alignment and this current call on sort of aligning national commitments is going to be really huge over the next few years. How do we support getting sort of concrete, quantifiable targets into national commitments that are then backed up by national policies to enable implementation? Finance is another pillar, I think, securing new and additional sources of finance, both formally under the UNFCCC and through sort of finance solutions, like I mentioned earlier, to channel private finance into some of these initiatives. And finally, very quickly, I think capacity building. I have seen that we have a lot of big picture guidance out there on adaptation, resilience, EBA. But I think when it comes to implementation, we'll need sort of really concrete blueprints of solutions that then can be tailored to local context. For instance, I'm part of a group led by Conservation International of engineers and architects collaborating on engineering guidelines for solutions like hybrid seawalls and levees. And this is an area that gets me quite excited. How do we stop sort of seeing EBA as a standalone solution, but instead integrate sort of principles and benefits into other development initiatives?
Right, that's really interesting. If you have any updates on these guidelines or something, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Now, I'm going to turn quickly again, please, Kristen or Dheeraj, you know, from your point of view, how can practitioners best work with governments to achieve the targets?
Much has been already said. So, and I think one thing that I really hope to see is sometimes what happens is, even if you have resources and if you have capacity, you are not able to implement for the fact that you don't know what to do it. So I think to promote a good practices that has worked well in one of the similar setting and be able and made that available to other areas, I think that would be a good way to really see how people across the globe, not just government and the public, but also across the globe, can undertake and implement a very successful adaptation works.
I like that. Thank you. Like, and yeah, especially in the case of peer learning. Thank you, Dheeraj. Kristen?
I think that practitioners can advocate for the endorsement and implementation of the locally led principles for adaptation, and that can happen at all levels, you know, of course, at the organizational level, but I'm sure most of us around the table have endorsed and use that framework. but I think it's something that national governments should also be endorsing, and that we can advocate for.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the three panelists. And now we're going to open the floor to see if our wonderful audience has some questions directly to the panelists. I think I'm passing on to Anya on the monitoring of the question. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right, Emily. I think many of the questions have already been answered in the chat. Certainly, we can raise a few again here in case people haven't been following along. I think one question that was interesting is just around looking at the global stocktake and whether there's been more discussion about the frequency of that occurring more rapidly than the 5-year cycle. Emily, I don't know if you have a chance to respond to that again here in the full forum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've hinted to that in the sense that, you know, it takes a lot of strategies and mechanisms to do effective and inclusive adaptation. And the UNFCCC and global processes are only one of these processes. And I really want to emphasize that. They give incredible global signals and directions, and sometimes are also able to set standards in order for countries and other practitioners, other actors to follow suit. So that's great, but they don't act. Like global frameworks don't have any remit in making sure that that actions are being implemented, especially on adaptation, where, you know, under the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, everything on adaptation is voluntary. So it's great to already, you know, the Paris Agreement has this assessment mechanism in terms of the global stocktake, where it is a good transparency and monitoring, evaluation, and reporting framework. And it's really, I think it's important to recognize the role of other actors. And I've pointed out to, for example, the IPCC and their assessment reports, in providing these additional complementary assessments that can also feed into the global stocktake as well. So that can also be part, you know, these are, IPCC is a big actor, or the UNEP adaptation gap report, also big actors, but you can take, even if you have a municipality or a community-based organization, they can also contribute and send their reports and their assessments to feed into the process. So it's very important to speak up and to tune in to what can be done within the industry processes.
That's a great point, and I think that leads into our next question from the audience as well, just in terms of, you've offered here some suggestions about what people can do moving forward to help inform future COPs and future decision-making processes. But speaking to all the panelists, what are your hopes going into COP29 and even looking forward to COP30? Obviously, some points have already been touched on in terms of the new finance goal, metrics for reporting, and what have you. But could people speak to additional concepts or expectations moving forward in these negotiations?
I could just jump in. I think that we've outlined quite a few things, but we definitely, what we saw from COP28 is some steps in the right direction. But for COP29 and COP30, we need to see much more ambition to secure climate and gender justice. So that, you know, I would love to see, it really gives me hope to see in the coming years, national governments coming really with strong ambition. And, you know, it would be great to see actually more announcements and concrete deliverables in terms of the climate financing, and in terms of really addressing in the negotiations in a more concrete way the structural issues, and acknowledging more the importance of locally led adaptation, specifically in negotiated outcomes.
For me, I hope to see that mountain takes a greater place in the discourses, for the fact that the 20% or 20% of the population, global population, lives in these high mountain systems. And also, I think 50% of the humanity depends on ecosystem services that flows down from the Himalaya or the mountains. So I think that really needs to be there in the forefront. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I want to echo a bit of what Kristen, you just said on sort of the ambition and sort of national ambition happening at the UNFCCC as well. I think this was, of course, this is about the global goal on adaptation. This came out really strongly in the Global Stocktake. Like, even if all of the indices were implemented perfectly, which they won't be, we still wouldn't meet in the 1.5 target, or I think 2.2 degrees either. So I think there is this sort of call for this escalating national ambition and sort of really giving these sort of concrete commitments of sort of what we are going to be doing practically over the next 5 years, 10 years. And I think it is good to see sort of that shift of, you know, I always say, like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Like, while all this is still happening under the UNFCCC, we also need to see sort of like countries moving forward on sort of their commitments on different topics as well.
And I think I'm going to hammer in some of the same points. Sorry, Morgan. The pressing need for adaptation is to know what is working, but also what is not working. And to me, that's really important, because that is going to inform how governments and how funding is being assessed. You know, for example, having locally led adaptation principles being followed, you know, in terms of flexible, long-term, predictable funding. You cannot deliver funding, and if you could throw 20 million over 2 years, this is highly risky. So governments need to be very clear about how they invest, about the quality of adaptation finance, not just the quantity, but also linked to that. I think governments, what I'd expect to see is developed country governments coming to the table with being ready to commit on adaptation finance, and in finance in general. This has been elusive since all global agreements, but I think there is no time to waste, and it is time that developed countries don't back out when coming at the table to do some commitments and to be ready to track them. So that's what I'm hoping. Thanks.
Emily, we do have another question, and that
Yes.
is, how do we manage the risk that we have already passed 1.5 degrees, or that we are headed inevitably in that direction from an adaptation perspective?
Okay, if another panelist would like to go first, then I can jump in after.
I mean, just very briefly, sorry, Kristen, I think you just went off mute as well. I mean, I think that is when sort of these discussions on adaptation finance, and loss and damage become even more critically important. The UNFCCC can't just focus on mitigation. I mean, that is a core element of the work, but if we are breezing past 1.5, these adaptation, resilience, and loss and damage discussions become absolutely critical.
It's such a tough question, because we know the implications of this are more floods, more fires, more loss of life, loss of livelihoods, and that shooting past the 1.5 target will mean so much damage for future generations. So it's absolutely critical that we really have to see this as all hands on deck. Everyone has a role to play in ensuring that we don't go past that target. I know that what resonates with a lot of people, and I'm sure around this table, is the impact that this is going to have on future generations. So it is our duty. It's our moral, ethical duty to really do everything that we can. Practitioners have a role to play. Youth-led organizations, women's rights organizations. We really have to, I think we're going to see more and more mobilization. We have to listen to the voices of the people that are the most impacted, bring their solutions forward. And yeah, Donna, that's an amazing question. And I think it's existential.
And I'm just going to add, you know, we may already be past the 1.5 degrees, but of course this affects different places differently. And it's not like if the planet, it's not in the prediction that it will suddenly explode and everything is going to disappear. So it's really about investing and developing creative and transformative adaptation strategies so that actually the world that is remaining and the world that is enduring can strive in a fair and inclusive manner. So that means also decolonizing development, decolonizing how we approach climate finance and how we approach global systems so that there are fair chances and pride and good living standards for everyone in the world, not just a few mostly located in Northern Hemisphere. Thanks.
I think if we are not successful in terms of rallying, marshalling everyone with the slogan of collective existence, I think we need to change the slogan and say collective marshal and rally everyone with the slogan of collective extinction.
I like that. We can try to make that trend, Dheeraj. Anya, maybe part of your post, like post webinar posts. And how are we doing with time, Anya? Go ahead.
The other way of framing it is also in the positive, you know, collective resilience, that, you know, together we can make we can turn this around. We know what needs to be done. We have the solutions. It's a matter of financing them, implementing them, and moving forward. So we can build resilience in our world.
Emily, I think we have time for just one more question if anyone from the audience has another question, and otherwise we can move on to our breakout groups and discuss these issues further.
Am I right, Anya? We're just about at time. So instead of sending, I could throw another question to our panel, but I would expect we will have a lot of good discussions in our breakout group. So if there are no more discussions or questions from the audience, then I'd suggest to go forward.
That sounds great, Emily. Let's do that. Let's we'll take pass it back over to Uju. We'll take a quick break and then we'll move into the discussion groups. Thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for that fruitful conversation. So like Anya mentioned, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. So we'll be coming back for those who are on Eastern Standard Time with me at 11:53. So yeah, we'll be taking a 5-minute break, and then once we come back, I'll be explaining how the breakout group discussions are going to work, and then we'll have a bit of time to have smaller group discussions. Thank you. Okay. All right, everybody. We'll be transitioning into the breakout group discussions. So I'm going to be introducing the various themes and then the facilitators for the group. I'll just first like to note that within the breakout groups, we are aiming to, cultivate an inclusive environment where everyone can feel comfortable, sharing their experiences and their ideas. So once we have an opportunity to get feedback on the various groups during the report back, we'll just ask that maybe we might not share specifics of people's names or organizations if people are uncomfortable doing so. So I'm going to be opening the breakout rooms momentarily, where we'll have one room facilitated by Emily Goodwin, which would be the room on climate, nature, and development. We'll have another room facilitated by Kristen, which would be on gender equality and intergenerational justice. And then we'll have another room facilitated by Deo, which would be on data and information systems. And then the last room facilitated by Emily Beauchamp, which would be on adaptation finance. So all the rooms, I've just opened them in. So the rooms are labeled by the facilitator and the topic of focus. So I'll just ask all of our speakers to join the room. So on Zoom, at the bottom menu bar, you see, if you click on the three dots, which says more, depending on how your screen is set up, you see the options for breakout rooms. And then when you see the breakout rooms, once you click on that, you'll see the different rooms that I've just mentioned. And then I'll just ask you to, self-assign yourself to whichever room that you're comfortable joining or that you're interested joining based on topic. Again, I'll re-emphasize there's one room by Emily Goodwin, which is on climate, nature, and development. There's another room facilitated by Kristen, which is on gender equality and intergenerational justice. Another one facilitated by Deo, which is on data and information systems. And then the last group facilitated by Emily Beauchamp, which is on adaptation finance. So I'll leave all of our participants a few seconds to please join the rooms as they see fit.
Wonderful. I think what our plan is now is to do a report back from the various discussion groups, recognizing that Emily does need to move off a little bit early to attend another session. Emily, Beauchamp, can we ask you to start with the report back from the finance group, please?
Yes, absolutely, and apologies about that. So we started by discussing, we had a handful of questions, mostly looking, and I'm gonna not to mess it up, that we're looking at as well, we're looking forward to COP29, which is going to be a big finance COP because of the new collective quantified goal on climate finance. So we were thinking, what are some key considerations that should inform the negotiations, and how can this adaptation finance be better directed to support gender responsive, socially inclusive, and biodiversity positive initiatives at the local level? And we had great comments from Mushfiqur from Bangladesh, who is working with the government, and who mentioned that one of the key considerations should be to target finance, really think about the marginalized groups, especially women and youth, because they are the most affected by climate. And he mentioned some of the schemes that are taking place in Bangladesh, for example, providing households and especially women and children with shelter when there are climate shocks, and making sure that they're not homeless and they maintain their livelihoods. We also discussed how education in supporting people, so financing education as adaptation to make sure that the population in general has better information and better abilities to make decisions when they're faced with climate shocks and climate changes. So, and finally, we discussed the role of the private sector in providing some of the gap in finance. And whilst there are a lot of companies that are extractive and that contribute to pollution, we also need to make sure they are included in the discussion so that they can have the incentives to become cleaner and to also internalize some of the impacts that they're causing and really address their supply chains. Also, let's not forget that companies can also fund community and local adaptation and resilience initiatives. And we had our colleague Jana, who was talking about how private sector companies are supporting communities, especially across the US as some of her examples, and providing more stable and secure finance that some governments can, because of the political cycle that may mean that your funding is uncertain. So that was a very good point. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Emily. Can we move on to Kristen, please, speaking to gender and intergenerational equity, please?
Wow, that 20 minutes went by so fast. We had a really, really great conversation, looking at how practitioners can better embody the principles of locally led adaptation, of course, especially with regards to gender equality, social inclusion, and intergenerational justice. We talked about some of the things that could be done. So microfinance, and what's the role of that, and how can we strengthen it in terms of adaptation initiatives? Then working with one of the ways that we can build more locally led adaptation efforts is working with youth groups, talking about activism, and seeing that activism and collective efforts really go together. We also wanted to do a little bit of a deeper dive in terms of, for example, how healthcare itself can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and can reduce waste. So, you know, reducing that impact of healthcare in itself. On the question of how practitioners can support advocacy initiatives, we talked about, again, about the importance of working with youth and putting into action projects that are really accessible to youth and youth-led. And the critical importance of financing meaningful youth participation. We discussed how youth can learn and internalize the effects of climate change, and that but not just that it's absolutely critical that climate education include concrete information and actions that youth can take. It was highlighted in our discussion also that advocacy has to really come from the community, and that has to be locally led. So we talked about locally led advocacy. Involving youth in our discussion was a lot about youth, as you can tell, programs, in youth programs, or in programs right from the beginning, and not just in climate related programs, but also in incorporating climate action and environmental concerns, embedding them in all of our programs. Then in terms of adaptation, there's an opportunity for us to direct and assist youth towards professions that can really make a difference in terms of adaptation, in terms of green technology, engineering, environmental protection, and that we can do this from, this needs to be expanded from and incorporated from an interdisciplinary perspective. One more thing. Oh, we want to make it practical. Organizations can make a practical contribution to reflect, both to have an impact in terms of their programs, but also reflect that impact of the programs back into the advocacy work. So I hope I've loyally represented our really great discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Kristen. And a really big thank you to Emily Beauchamp for leading the panel discussion, and also for your presentation today. We just so greatly appreciate your expertise that you draw into this conversation. Moving forward, could I ask, Emily Goodwin to report back on our Climate, Nature and Development group, please?
Sure, thank you. So briefly, I'll start with saying in our panel earlier, right, we talked about how at the international level, a lot of the upcoming priorities are about shifting into sort of enabling national ambition and national action. But in our group, we sort of had this discussion on like, how do these international COP goals actually translate to improving people's lives on the ground? And there's definitely this sense of sort of disconnect and disillusionment about the UNFCCC process, given the realities of what's happening on the ground. This UNFCCC process is supposed to create the enabling environment and sort of set the signal for the rest of the world to then implement, but it's really failing on sort of, particularly on mitigation, but also on adaptation. So we talked a bit about how we really now have this like groundswell of local action trying to turn the tides. A few different gaps and barriers that were brought up in our group. One was we talked about sort of the time frame of project implementation, particularly on sort of nature-based adaptation initiatives, is one of the barriers, and sort of the real importance of coupling sort of this question of long-term ecological resilience with short-term benefits to communities, be that in livelihoods, food security, finance, but then also discussed really the issue with sort of donor finance structures and sort of public funding structures for this as well, with sort of rapid expectations to sort of absorb funds, develop community relationships, to have these sort of locally led initiatives in really short timeframes. Finally, we also talked about the importance of really aligning sort of the international, national, subnational policy, and really sort of emphasizing that a lot of what is driving the enabling conditions on the ground and driving these initiatives on the ground is sort of local policy and subnational leaders, and making sure that that is both seen in the UNFCCC and that those things are sort of connected and flowing sort of top down and bottom up to one another. Oh, you're muted, yeah.
Pardon me. Thank you. I was saying, thank you so much for that. It's yeah, really good point in terms of just how we're breaking down some of those silos and working at all the different levels of decision making and action as well. Malika, are you reporting back for us for data information systems, please?
Sure. So Gerard and myself were in this breakout group. So I think also building upon some of the other conversations that were there, we talked a lot about how you can ensure that at a community level and at a local level, because we talked about the fact that, you know, community is not a holistic term. So there's different ways in which that data would need to be presented and different incentives that need to be there. One of the things we talked about quite a lot is the difference between the long-term and the short-term vision. So how do you, again, when there's different scales of thinking, maybe when things are not as immediate, how do you bring the incentives for people to make those immediate changes when there's so many different priorities, and to see them as something to be acted upon? Again, we talked about just being something that data needs to be brought to the local level in a way that's understood. For example, there's the governments, there's the communities, there's different stakeholders who are making the decisions. And how can you make that happen effectively? Just going to also check back in some of our notes, the things that we talked about. So again, we talked about one of the important things being this idea of iterative process that I think I've heard repeated in a couple of different ways, that you really do need to adapt to the local context. There isn't a one-fits-all solution. And you also need to have the ability to be flexible enough when to be able to act on the data, or to be able to ensure that, especially when you're working at a community level, if things are not working, that you can course correct and change. And that happens through good M&E systems and good feedback loops. And how you can build those in, particularly in different donor-funded projects, is a challenge in some ways, which is something we don't necessarily have solutions for, but something that we need to be mindful of and look at ways of how to build on those and how to address those. We also talked again about the question of how locally collected data and how we can bridge across scales for locally led information to be heard at UNFCCC levels. And again, I think one of the things that we mentioned is that this has become an area of growth and an area in which there's been so much emphasis, but it's still about making space and not just the gaining of space, and what can be done to ensure that resources are put there for voices to be heard in the right way, because that's a process that needs you know, a lot of building and a lot of space to both be given, but also to be brought in the right way. And that's where the right data presented can also be used as for this evidence-based decision making. But again, it needs to be done at both scales, echoing, I think, from Emily's point, that it's the bottom-up and the top-down approach. And it's not just about space being there and knowing that it's there, but, you know, when it's Indigenous voices or community voices or marginalized communities or minorities, again, you need to really be able to break down that notion of community in multiple ways and ensure that all those voices are heard, and not that then they're not just, you know, captured by certain stakeholders. Yep.
Thanks so much, Malika. That's really fabulous points, I think, just in terms of looking at the different ways of knowing and the different forms of knowledge and how we're valuing all of those within the context of a project. Thank you all so much for the discussions, for the report backs, and to all our participants who engaged in those discussions. We really feel there's so much value to be able to broaden the conversation out to all of you and be able to have the opportunity to delve into these issues on a deeper level with the panelists, with our speakers. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass it back over to Obianuju for our closing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya, and thank you everyone who has stayed with us. So just very quickly before we head out, I would just like us to take a bit of time to reflect on today's session. So we would love to hear from you as to, what is one key takeaway that you're having from today's session. But please first, if my colleague can put in the chat, the link to join the post-event survey, or you can scan the QR code as well if you have a separate device. And we just have a few questions that we'd like to get your response to. The first being obviously you responding to your level of satisfaction with today's event. The second question, we want to know, did you learn something new about global development issues, and in this case, related to climate adaptation initiatives? And then if so, we really like to know what did you learn, and what was or what is your takeaway from today's conversation? What is something that you are taking away with you into your workspace, into your personal life, into your research, into something that you will continue to mull over from today's conversation, from the resources that were shared by our speakers as well. We'd also like to know, anything that you liked or disliked about today's event content, any suggestions that you might have, and then also similarly about the format, and then any suggestions, and then any other thoughts that you have to share with us, please go ahead and do so. And then lastly, or rather before we get to the last question, just obviously we'd like you to identify yourself in terms of the various categories that are on the screen, and then also for our reporting perspective, we also like to know how people are self-identifying for the people who are responding. So again, please use the link in the chat. You can scan the QR code. It's just a Microsoft form that you can fill out at any time. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. I know we had Emily Beauchamp that dropped off a bit earlier, but thank you all for spending precious 2 hours plus with us and spending time with all of our guests in the breakout group discussions. We'll be sharing all of the pertinent information and resources to everyone after the session, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thank you, everyone.